what in the world is happening to the design industry? Where are the entry level jobs? What is AI going to do to us? Where is it all headed? So the bad news is we are all terrified. No one has any idea what's happening. Designers want to think of themselves as good people because everybody wants to think of themselves as a good person. But designers have a real ego problem. They have a real hipster problem. That's just built into the brain. Like it's just there. Like there's nothing you can do about it. You can't intellectualize your way into being like, don't worry about things in your peripheral vision.
Biases and assumptions have been part of the human experience for as long as we've been around. How can we, as user experience designers, make sure that our biases do not translate over to our designs? For today's episode, we have a special guest named Jon Bell. He's been in the field for 2 decades. He's currently working at a stealth startup. Before that, he was at Replay.io as a founding designer. Prior to that, he was at Twitter as their staff product designer. And before that, at Windows or Microsoft as their senior UX designer. So, Jon, I'm so glad that you're here. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so can you give us a short introduction for somebody who doesn't know you?
Yeah, sure. I started working in tech in the year 2000, and back then there were no UX designers. So I had a multimedia degree, and I did a little bit of code and a little bit of Photoshop, and just sort of what we would now call a product designer. And so I've been doing that for a long time. I worked at Real Networks that made the Real Player, which is kind of like YouTube before YouTube. And yeah, I've worked at Microsoft and Twitter and big companies and small companies, and sort of done a lot of different cool things. And I also really like to talk about design, and I really like to write about design. So really looking forward to our chat today.
Today's icebreaker is called Two Truths and One Dream. So, how it works is you've heard of the game Two Truths and a Lie. Basically, you will tell two true things about you or two facts about yourself, and then one dream.
Okay. One fact about me is that my brother is 11 years older, and so it's just the two of us, and it was kind of like having two dads because he was so much older that yeah, he acted more as a dad than a sibling. The second truth is that it turns out we actually have a sister, same parents, but we have a sister, and we only got to meet her for the first time 2 years ago. So she's in her 50s, and the family has been looking for her all this time. She was put up for adoption, and she was trying to find the family, and we were trying to find her, and we finally met her, and it was an amazing experience. So that's number two. And then a dream, I love to give talks and I love to teach. And a dream that I have is actually to do like a one man show or even stand up comedy. So instead of like talking about design and talking about tech, which is stuff that I talk about all the time, actually putting together a theater production or as I said, even trying to do stand up comedy. That's something I've always thought of. And one day I might actually do it.
Wow. I've seen your design explosions, so I think it sounds a bit similar in
Mm,
some ways.
hmm. Yeah,
In some
absolutely.
ways. Great. So this podcast is for beginners, right? So
Mm.
because of the audience and all of that, I'm just very curious to know where did you get started in terms of UX specifically? Because I've read your book and you've mentioned stories about when Apple was just getting started. So did you get started back then already or after or what was your story?
I think the first thing that I talk to a lot of designers that are starting out, and I do a lot of just like mentoring and stuff. And I think the first thing that I would say, if you're watching this and you're new, is it's just different for everybody, and by that I mean in eras, in generations. So if you were to talk to a 90-year-old person and you were to say like, how'd you get your first job, that's fine if you're curious for some like museum type answer, like, oh wow, you're 90 and your first job was in a factory or whatever. But their advice to you for how to get a job is just not going to be relevant because they're 90. Another comparison would be like if you were to talk to Paul McCartney from the Beatles. Paul McCartney from the Beatles was very successful and got very rich, and everybody knows the Beatles. But if you were to say to Paul McCartney, who's, I assume he's in his 80s by now, if you were to say to him, you know, how do I get into music? He's not going to have any idea. Like he can tell you, like, well, back in the 50s, I played in Berlin. Like he would have stories, and they're interesting, but they're completely irrelevant. Like yeah, Paul McCartney has no idea how to get on TikTok. Paul McCartney has no idea how to go viral on Instagram. Um, he just doesn't know, and it doesn't. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that he's old, and I think that's sort of the first thing I'd say about where I come from is like I'm old. Uh, my jobs, the way that I got jobs and the way that I got started, just aren't relevant to 2024 anymore. So I can tell you as if I'm a 90-year-old, but that's not relevant. So in my particular case, in the 80s, when the 1984 Macintosh came out, that was one of the first times people felt like they could have a computer in their home. And my brother, the one who's 11 years older than me, he was a developer. He liked to write code. And my dad is a computer nerd. And so I just had computers in my house in the 80s. And I had these two very smart people in my life who gave me access to technology. And so for me, I was just one of these nerds where I just really liked computers in the 80s. And so when the internet first really started hitting, where it was like really a thing people were hearing about, that would have been the early 90s. Other people had heard about it the way that you might hear about 3D modeling or 3D printing, or you might hear about, doing really complex things with AI or whatever. Other people had heard of the internet, but I was actually like on the internet. So I totally had a head start. And then by 1995, when it was more mainstream, I had already been doing internet things for, 5, 6, 7 years. Um, so as the internet blew up, and as you started seeing these companies really make something of themselves, I remember Yahoo was the first one where everybody working at Yahoo became practically a millionaire overnight. And that was a surprise at the time. Nobody thought tech companies were going to make money. And so when Yahoo made a lot of money when they IPO'd in probably 96 or 7, um, I could look at those people making all that money and doing those jobs. I could look at them even though I was a teenager, and I could say, I can do that. I know how to do those skills. That is a thing that I've been practicing in my bedroom. I can do that. So for me, of course, I worked hard, but gosh, it was about 10% working hard and about 90% that I was just very, very lucky that my hobby happened to become quite popular in the 90s. So yeah, that's how I got started. As I was just a computer nerd, and then computers became a job.
Wow, what a story. That's amazing. I was very curious to know how you got started. Because, like you said, the days are so different from back then to today. Yes. So I read this quote in your book that I would love to hear not just your feedback on, but expanded on it and your thoughts on it further than just what you wrote in the book, because I'm sure you have more to say about it. And the quote says, it's worth remembering that it's not our job to design for ourselves. It's our job to understand and design for all people. But when we spend much of our time with fellow designers, both online off and off, we run the risk of isolating ourselves from a broader audience. So can you expand on that?
Oh, yeah. So anybody that knows me has heard me talk about this at length because I feel very strongly about this. Um, Again, if you're watching this and you're new to design, this is the story that I tell everybody. It's really important to understand the point of this story. So I'm in my mid 20s and I'm a fancy designer and I'm so proud of myself because I'm a designer. And I'm working at a tech company and we need to take out some ads, some banner ads, right? Just, wide, not very tall banner ads. And I didn't design them. We got another company to design them. They made 5 banner ads for us. And they said, "Hey, John, you went to art school. What do you think?" And I said, "Okay, I'll rank them in order. I think this is the best. This is the second best. Da 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 da. And this is like the worst. I can't even believe they gave us this. It's horrible." And then they ran the numbers. And what they found is that there was a perfect inverse relationship, which is to say, the banner ad that I hated the most made the company the most money. The ad that I liked the second, that I hated the second most, made the second most money. And the one that I liked the most, the one that I thought was the best possible banner ad, did horribly, made no money. And that was a very, very sobering experience. And it was one that I wish more designers would go through, realizing, oh, my taste as a designer is oriented around, it has to be perfect, it has to be beautiful, it has to be just so. It turns out that that leads you astray. Now, I'm not arguing that you should make ugly things, but when somebody tells you that they like, for example, sports, a lot of designers, at least in my where I'm, in my group of friends, most of my group of friends, we don't like sports. I personally do like sports, but like most designers don't like sports. Or in tech, most people that I know in tech, if they talk about religion at all, they'll be like, "Oh, I don't believe in God." And if you say, "Well, what do you think about this band?" Nickelback. Everybody hates Nickelback. It's a band that everybody loves to hate. And I don't like them either, for what it's worth. But then you look at how many records they sold, and they are one of the most successful bands of all time. So, religion, sports, and Nickelback. Designers hate all three of those, at least in my group of friends. And so, understanding that designers care a lot about designer things, and that is not necessarily what everyone else thinks. I think, in my opinion, that's the first step to having true empathy as a designer. Designers love talking about empathy because it makes you sound all like sophisticated and like you care about people and you want to make the world a better place. It's all BS. Designers want to think of themselves as good people because everybody wants to think of themselves as a good person. But designers have a real ego problem. They have a real hipster problem. And yeah, step one of understanding that is realizing like it doesn't matter if you believe in God, because the majority of the world does. It doesn't matter if you like this banner ad, if it's the one that makes your company money. It doesn't matter if you don't like Nickelback, because they have more fans than your favorite band, I'm positive. So, yeah, that's sort of been a guiding light in my career, and it's one of my secret weapons. When I'm talking to business people at my company, or I'm talking to developers at my company, I'm always able to keep my ego in check because I've been wrong so often that I think I'm more open to the idea that maybe I don't know what the customer wants. And that's been my secret weapon. It makes it much easier to work with me than with some Steve Jobs type who sort of always thinks they're right. So that's guided my whole career.
I love that story that you just told because it also makes me think about biases of how I know for myself that sometimes when I'm looking at designing something, I tend to look for what I like instead of what the user, the end user will be using or what they want. And so, can you go maybe more into depth about biases and how that story relates?
Yeah, I think the big takeaway for me with bias is just admitting right up front that all humans have bias. It's built into the way that the brain works. And so I always get a little bit concerned. I'm a white guy, but I was raised by a very strong feminist mom, and I think one thing that she was able to sort of teach me pretty young is the men who say, "Oh, I'm a good guy," I'm one of the good ones. I'm an ally. I'm on your side. People who sort of lead with that, uh, it's kind of a weird counterintuitive thing, but they can sometimes be the ones that struggle the most because it's this blind spot. They think, oh, but I'm one of the good ones. Like I could never mess up. And so I think step one is like, yeah, like you can think that you're sexist or racist or against this group or that group or whatever it is. You can think that all you want, but I think the more you assume that you're like one of the good ones, the harder you'll fall. Like the easier it is to overlook your own biases. Um, I was in Russia and I was giving a talk, and it was really interesting. Up in the back of the room to ask a question, raises her hand, and she says, "Do you sometimes feel like the only sane person on the internet?" And think about what ego wants to do when that happens, right? Think about like you're out with friends, and somebody says, "Hey, doesn't it just seem like everyone is a bad driver?" You want to be like, "I'm a great driver," or like, "Doesn't it seem like just everyone's lazy?" You want to be like, "I'm not lazy." Your ego wants to be exceptional. Your ego wants to sort of be like, "Yeah, I'm not like that. I would never do that dumb thing." And so when the person in the back of the room raised her hand and said, "Do you sometimes feel like the only sane person?" And I found myself, and it was very hard, but I found myself forcing myself not to go for the easy, thing and say, but this is the problem right here. This is the issue.
Mhm.
Everybody, when they're in a fight, they think, well, I am representing the right point of view because I'm me. And they're the crazy ones. So if you get in a car accident, it was their fault. If you have a breakup with someone, it's because my ex is crazy. Like that's what your brain wants to think. And they actually have a concept of the emotional immune system. So just like how a disease can come in and your immune system tries to fight it off, we have an emotional immune system. If you try to ask somebody for a job and they say no to you, your brain starts like, yeah, well, they sucked anyway. Did you see, like, he had a stain on his shirt? I didn't want to work for him anyway. You find all these reasons to push them away so it doesn't hurt as much. So, all of that to say, my big, again, I'm a straight white guy from America. So I am like playing on easy mode, as they say. And so it would be really, really easy, and a lot of people do this, be really easy for me to be like, I think we're exaggerating bias. I think everyone is judged based on the quality of their work. And I think the world is fundamentally fair. No, like you have to at least open your mind to the idea that maybe there are things that you're not seeing. I want to tell one last story about that, by the way. I have two young girls, they're 12 years old. And I was listening to an episode of This American Life. And there is a machine where you can attach things to your body and it emulates how it feels to have menstrual cramps. And women, like they carry this machine around and people try it and women, yeah, this is what it feels like. And then these women who, like, I couldn't even get out of bed if it was this bad. I had no idea. And then they give it to men, and men, of course, have not experienced menstrual cramps. And it really, really frustrated me in this podcast because about 75%, pretty much all said, I thought women were exaggerating, and I don't think this machine is real. I think that when my girlfriend explains to me that she has cramps, I think that she's just looking for attention, and it's all in her head, and she just needs on men. And you turn it up to 5, 6, 7, and instead of saying, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, this seems bad. What can I do to help? Let me know how I can help." No, a lot of these guys are like, "This can't be true." The feeling, and even ones that eventually admitted that it must be true, they then would say things like, one guy literally said, "Why don't you make more of a fuss about this? If it hurts this much, why don't you say more?" He was the same complaining more in common. And what designers need to understand is like, we all have those biases. We all struggle to see things through other people's eyes. And as soon as you believe that you're going to be good at it because you're a good person, I'm telling you, you're going to be worse at it than average. You have to admit you're probably average at it, or maybe worse than average. And only then can you start to actually get better at uncovering bias and getting better at it. And it makes you a better designer because you start actually listening better.
Wow. So, what are some practical steps that we could do, or practices, or something practical that we can apply today that will help us to not fall into those traps?
Gosh, I don't know. I wish somebody would tell me. Um, I think all I've learned is just be aware that your brain is trying to get you to be biased. It is making a bunch of cognitive shortcuts. I always say, like, this is something that's good to know. Like, for those that don't know this, the reason that blinking text is annoying, or like, a thing just doing this, the reason it is annoying is that our brains have evolved over time to not get eaten by lions and bears. That's the way I put it anyway. Your brain has a bunch of wiring that's been there for like a long time. And so the idea that you have a peripheral vision and you need to be aware of things happening over here, it is because we used to get eaten by predators. So that's just built into the brain. Like, it's just there. Like, there's nothing you can do about it. You can't intellectualize your way into being like, don't worry about things in your peripheral vision. There's no lions that are going to eat you in New York City. Like, you can't do that. You can't intellectualize your way out of it. And the same is true with, sexism, racism, just whatever. We are wired to be scared of the others. When we see people who we don't personally know, or they strike us as weird or different, our brain is just screaming like, danger! They're probably a problem. You should probably be freaked out. And it takes a tremendous amount of effort to get that dumb lizard brain to go away long enough to do the correct human thing. And that is actually the evolution of humans of society over hundreds of years. We used to see others and just kill them. And then we like came up with a bunch of laws. We're like, we should probably not kill people. Killing people is probably not good. And we started building up these systems to kind of take that dumb lizard brain and be like, look, as much as you want to kill this person, we're going to set up this whole system with judges and juries and jails and appeals, and we're going to come up with this whole system. That whole system is built on top of our dumb lizard brains, so we don't run around and kill people and just run around and do dumb animal things. So when you say, are there practical things, I don't know. I think it's just, number one, understanding that we're just dumb monkeys. Like, we have old brains, and there's nothing that you can do about it. It's just built in. So in my life, people have taught me a lot about cognitive biases, just, issues. If your brain was computer code, there are a bunch of bugs, there are a bunch of flaws. And so just being aware of the different biases that are out there, there's confirmation bias. I was just talking about this at work today. Confirmation bias is the idea that when you go and you interview somebody and you want them to say, yes, I like this design, you're going to do everything in your power to get them to say, yes, I like this design. And even if they are telling you they don't like the design, you're just going to kind of ignore that part, and then they're going to say something like, oh yeah, this design's pretty good. You're going to be like, yes, they like it. And you're going to go write up your notes, and you're going to be like, they love the design because I'm an amazing person and it's great. And then you go and you put that design out into the world, and then it fails because you didn't pay attention. So yeah, I think the most practical thing that I could say to someone starting out is learn about how the brain is wired to be biased. It wants to be biased, it wants to do these dumb shortcuts, and you cannot think your way out of them. You have to come up with whole systems to get around those biases. Um, it's a lot of effort. But again, the first step is just learning that those biases exist in our brains in the first place. And then you can find strategies to sort of counter those effects.
That's nice. The what's it called? The cognitive biases as well is something that in the course I guess my question is, where can a beginner like myself learn more besides courses and all that? Where would you recommend that somebody would go and learn about this topic?
Uh, are books? Can I suggest some books? Would that be a reasonable, practical response?
Sure, you can recommend whatever you want.
There is a book called Designing with the Mind in Mind, and a lot of what I'm describing here, it is taking from that science and from that research. Um, there is a most famous UX designer named Don Norman, and he has a talk called "Why Design Makes Us Happy," something like that. It's only 20 minutes, quite good, highly recommended. Um, about this ever, where I got most of what I just said. It's funny. It's my favorite talk, and it also happens to be my best friend. So that's fun. Um, but he's a designer at Meta Awards, and he's written books about design, and he's just this like extraordinary designer. Maybe he'll come on your podcast or on this. Um, he's a really extraordinary person. And William and Hecky has a talk on the internet called "Your App is Good and You Should Feel Good." And I watched him do the talk we did a talk in South Africa. Wow, this should be required viewing. It's so spot on. Not just on this particular topic, but like it's just a great talk for all designers. But yeah, it very much gets into like how the brain is wired and like how you need to keep that in mind when you're designing. So yeah, those are the three that I would recommend. Designing with the Mind in Mind. That's a book. Don Norman talking about how design makes us happy, which talks about a lot of this. And then finally, William Van Hecky, Your App is Good and You Should Feel Good.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much for the recommendations. I'll make sure to put them in the show notes and descriptions and all of that stuff. So,
Cool.
my next question, I guess, is since we're done talking about biases, I'm not sure if you want
Mhm.
to unpack it more, but what, I guess, what would you want to share now if there's something that you would want to say or that you're working on, not necessarily work wise, but anything that you would want to share or design related for somebody who's just starting out?
Well, it is a terrifying topic, and it's one that I should start by saying I don't have any answers, but I have some guesses. And that is, what in the world is happening to the design industry? Where are the entry level jobs? What is AI going to do to us? Where is it all headed? And I'd love to share some thoughts about that. And again, just like I said before about how like you can't listen to Paul McCartney about how to get on TikTok. I'm 45 years old. I'm later in my career. So I don't have to go through the challenge of being, let's say, 22 years old and just coming out of uni and trying to get a job. So like I can't relate, right? I'm in a different stage in my life. And so you should take my words with a grain of salt, but I do have some thoughts to share there. And before I dive in on that, like let me know if you have any other questions that I should factor into some stuff that I'm going to say about AI. Do you have any other thoughts to
No, I
to?
don't have any other thoughts. I was actually very curious about this topic because uh, somebody in the audience asked when I was telling them, "Hey, I'm going to be talking to designers who've been in the field for at least 20 years, and do you have any questions?" And the question that came up was, "Where are the entry level jobs?" So I'm really, really curious to hear your
Yeah.
thoughts on that.
All right, so I've got bad news, but when I'm done talking about the bad news, I've got some good news after it. So the bad news is we are all terrified. No one has any idea what's happening. I know people that work making so much money at the like big fancy companies. I know people doing agency work. I know people across young, old, agency, Facebook, Meta. I have a range. We're all freaking out. We don't know. It's tough. And so I think the first thing that I would say is let's not pretend that it's not scary. It's scary. No one has ever seen anything like this. I went through 2001. There were a lot of layoffs in the first dot-com crash, early 2000s. Went through that. I went through the global financial crisis in 2007, 8, 9. Um, I've seen things go up and down. I've seen trends come and go. This is new and it is terrifying. And just for anybody watching this, if you're feeling scared, yeah, like that is a reasonable, it's a reasonable feeling. So that's the first thing I'll say. And that's sad, but I just want to be honest. Like, it's not like we're sitting over here as experienced designers being like, everything's going to be great. It's going to change a lot. So that's the first thing I'll say. It is scary. Secondly, I genuinely have no idea how anyone's going to get an entry level job anymore. And I would rather be depressing and blunt and very realistic than surprise people later. So for example, you hear stories of people like they go to New York City or some big city. They go to a big city and they're like, yeah, I'm gonna make it. And then they end up like not making it. Like it's really hard. You hear stories of people that want to be the next big movie star. So they go to Los Angeles, they try to make it in Hollywood, and they don't make it because like it's like a lottery. I mean, 1 million people show up, but only one gets to be the next big star, if not fewer. Um, Tech and also video games. Tech and video games have sort of turned into that new thing where there's just way more people that want to get into the field than jobs. And that's just the case. And it's sad. And it's always been hard, but it is now, it almost feels impossible now. So again, that's very sad to say. And I wish I wasn't giving that guidance. I've gone through this for 20 years and I usually tell people, well, try this and try that, and you might make it. Now I've never been as pessimistic. So again, very sad, but I just want to be realistic. It's tough. So that's the bad news. I will now start talking about some good news and some things that people can practically do. Thing number one.
Yes, please.
Yeah, it's all about the entrepreneurship. We didn't used to have a job, PM or product manager. And then a bunch of people just kind of did it. And then we realized that we needed them. We didn't used to have a role called UX designer. We just had a bunch of people like me who just did it. And then we eventually gave it the name UX designer. We didn't used to have a title for someone named product designer. And people just kind of did it. You can also use examples like influencer, right? Influencer was not a job 10 years ago or maybe 20 years ago is a better thing. We didn't used to have a job title of YouTuber. Um, we are about to see so many new types of jobs that we haven't thought of yet. And so what tech world is going to reward are the people that understand business, understand how to be an entrepreneur, and just work really, really hard. A big part of being an entrepreneur is talking to a lot of different, like literally quality educational content. So going and doing crash courses for like running a business and being an entrepreneur and networking and whatever. The fact that you, by the way, have set this up, this is a very good sign for you, because for everyone like you that thinks about doing something like this, 1% actually do it or whatever it is. So if you make the assumption, which is a very good assumption, if you make the assumption that in 5 years, there's going to be jobs that we didn't even conceive of in 2024, and if you make the assumption that the schools are going to be very slow to teach you how to do those things, I mean, schools can't teach you how to become a YouTuber. Schools can't teach you how to become an influencer. Schools still, even now, don't do a good job teaching you how to be a product designer. So if you make the assumption that traditional education is always going to be lagging by 10, 20, 30 years, and that it's really designed for things like learning a language or learning sciences, and it's not particularly good at these sort of more cutting edge things, The key for anybody watching this is like, don't try to be a UX designer. Try to figure out what's next along with the rest of us. Like we're all trying to figure it out. So if you take 100 people and let's say they're all 18 years old, they're all trying to figure out what they're going to go do for university, for example. Um, of those 100, I guarantee you, let's say, so all of them think they want to be a UX designer. And let's say all 100 of them watch me saying these words to them. Some percentage of them won't believe me, so they won't put in the effort and they'll just try to be a UX designer at a big company like Google and they won't get in and then they'll wonder what happened. And frankly, they'll fail. So some percentage of people are just not going to listen to it. Another percentage of people are going to hear the words and be able to just like make a list, work down the list, get the qualifications they need to talk to the, like they'll probably the largest percentage. And then on the other end, they hear this and they go, okay, I hear you. UX design is changing. Product design is changing. A lot of people believe that literally the designer role is going to disappear. We're still going to refer to people as designers, but they're not going to do. The title will exist. The tasks will be completely different. So some percentage of people watching something like this, maybe 5%, maybe 1%, they hear something like this and they go, okay, I hear you. That's terrifying. I don't like hearing that. And they're talk to as many people as they can, just like this, just like you're doing. They are also going to learn as much about entrepreneurship as they can. They're going to learn as much as they can about business. They're going to learn as much as they can about writing code. They're going to learn as much as they can about anything that change everything. Those people, whether it's 1% or 5%, those people are going to look back at something like this in 10 years. And it's going to seem self-evident that it was time to learn AI. It's time to learn code. It's time to learn people. It's time to learn business. And they're going to look back as millionaires, like looking back in 10 years. They're going to be like, yeah, back in 2024, we didn't yet know that there's going to be a new position called a blah, blah, blah. So I went and I invented that position. And the thing is, I can say that because I'm 45 and I've seen it with my own eyes. They didn't know how to describe me. Back in 2003, I had a two-sided resume or CV. It had to be two-sided because they didn't have a concept of a UX designer. So on one side of my resume, it was like, I can write code. Da, 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 da. And then I would literally make you flip it around. It was printed because I'm an old person. I'd flip it around and it'd be like, I went to art school. I can do watercolor. I can do comics. I can draw. And here's what happened to me. I would apply for jobs. And if it was a code job, they would look at the code and they'd be like, you're okay. And then they would flip it around and they'd be like, oh, you seem more like an artist. And I wouldn't get the job. And then I would apply for more creative positions and they would see the creative thing and they'd be like, okay, watercolor, comics, you went to art school. All right. I mean, you're fine. You're not that good, but like, and then they would flip it around and they'd see the code and they'd be like, oh, so you're a developer. So I wouldn't get that job either. So I was just sitting there for a while being like, I don't understand. Like, I feel like I have good skills. What it was is that I was too early for the market. The market, it was like, you either know Photoshop or you know databases. And they couldn't figure out where to place me. If you ever saw the Pixar movie Wall-E about the little robot, there's a scene at the beginning of Wall-E where he's organizing things. And he goes, this goes here, this goes here, this goes here. And then he picks up a spork. And the spork is a spoon and a fork. And he's got a pile of forks over here and a pile of spoons over there. And there's this great moment where he goes, and then he just makes its own pile, the spork pile. He's like, it doesn't fit either of these, so I guess I'm going to make a new pile. That is what the successful UX designers of the future are going to do. They're not going to be called UX designers. They are people who are hacking away at learning AI as well as they possibly can. They are figuring out code as well as they possibly can with the benefit of AI. They are learning business skills. They are learning entrepreneurial skills. They are talking to as many people as possible. They're doing things like this. And I'm telling you, they're going to look back in 5 years and the UX role as we know it is going to disappear, but they're not going to care because, like I said a minute ago, I had to give it a fake name, so I'm going to use the same fake name again. The role of blah, blah, blah is going to happen, and there's going to be some head of blah, 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 and they're going to be on a podcast aged 45, and someone's going to say, how'd you get your start? Just like you did. And they're going to start by saying, like, well, you have to understand, like, when I came up in 2024, there was no concept of a blah, blah, blah yet. So what I went and I did is I saw Jon Bell talk on this podcast, and he was like, I don't know, go figure out AI and entrepreneur. So that's what I did. And then I just basically fell into being a blah, blah, blah. And because I knew enough people, when they needed a blah, 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 I just happened to be in demand, and I happened to ride that. So I know for a fact that that's going to happen. I just don't know the exact skills, right? I don't know the exact name. I don't know the exact field. I don't know the details, but I've seen this happen multiple times in my career, and I know it to be the case. Do not count on the way things look right now. It's all going away. So just figure out what's next and work hard, and that's the way forward.
Wow. Wow. So it's not just studying UX design, it's studying UX along with entrepreneurship and coding and people skills, networking, and all of that. Wow.
But one thing that I would say is don't think of that as, oh, I was going to go read one book and now I have to read 5 books. That's not the takeaway.
Mhm.
It's not as defined as do this, 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 and you'll be fine. It's more do a thought exercise in your mind like they do with science fiction, right? So, like in science fiction, imagine a world like, so there's a movie called Children of Men, and it's a world where people can't make babies anymore. So, like, what happens to the world? Or, what happens in Star Wars? Like, if we can now have like laser swords and you can do lightsabers. So, science fiction and speculative thinking does a really good job at like imagining the future in 5 years. So I think my big takeaway for you, like, yes, definitely figure out entrepreneurship, look into AI, look into code, but don't think of it as like that. Those are checklist activities. Think of it more as just when you're imagining what to do with your career, just make the assumption that in 5 years, this will all go away. And I don't mean go away in the sense that it will explode and it'll be, you know, like a desert or something. What I mean by go away is that culture changes so quickly, we don't even notice it when it's happening. There's a great quote from Bill Gates. They said, we overestimate how much things will change and change, know it to be true. And so I think the big takeaway for me is not so literal as like code, AI, entrepreneurship. It's more imagine what you think the world will look like when you don't need design anymore. You just go say, make me a marketing website that is elegant and features, puppies. And you'll press a button and it'll be designed for you. So that world exists today, let alone in 5 years. And take 2 weeks to like think through all the flows manually, that's going away. That will not exist. So what do we do? Like, how do you think ahead? You go, okay, all right. Gosh, if the world, if the world in Figma, I don't know if you saw this, but Figma a few months ago, they actually announced an AI tool where you can go in and say, design me a weather app, enter, and it just does it. Okay, so that exists already right now. They had to withdraw it because people got mad at them, but it's coming. So I think that would be my takeaway is like, go do some journaling. That's the other thing is, but I would go and I would just write 500 words. Like, okay, imagine a world where the CEO of a company or the developer of a company or the product manager of a company, they no longer want to hire designers because they just go into AI and they just say, design this for me, enter, and it does. And then they go, I need a better image on the top. Can we make that woman smile? And she does. That technology exists today, let alone in 5 years. So in that world, how do you make yourself, anybody watching this, how do you make yourself absolutely what's the word I'm looking for? How do you make yourself like an obvious hire? You don't do it by saying, well, I learned Figma over the summer and Now I can make a couple screens. Like that's going away. What they want is someone that can drive the, whoops, my hair goes that way. They want someone that can drive the AI better than anyone else can drive the AI. If you can walk into a room and say, I can design anything for you in 5 minutes because I'm really, really good at AI, that is a job that I can see existing in 1 year. But walking in and saying, like, yeah, give me 2 weeks, I'll design an app that'll take AI 30 seconds, like, well, no, it's not going to exist. So that would be the takeaway. I think it's AI, entrepreneurship, business, um, code. That's what I think it is. I might be wrong. Um, but I think it would be an activity for anyone watching this just to think through, like, okay, if the technology already exists today to make the designer position irrelevant, what are you going to do about it? I would say one last thing about that, and that's teaching. If you, even as a newbie, if you can find a skill that a company wants to pay you for, um, maybe a traditional UX designer who's used to just like working in Figma and then handing something off, maybe it becomes like, oh yeah, you don't want to hire me as a UX designer. You want to hire me as someone that really understands technology and creativity and how to align the two. Because I used to be an audio engineer. And what I can do is I can make any technology work, and I can make any technology work through my awesome creativity lens. And so you want to hire me to do projects, not as a full time designer necessarily, but because like I know how to work really well with computers and you like talking to me, those types of jobs, people that can like talk to the CEOs and talk to leadership and teach people things, inspire people. Those are really important roles. I want to say one last thing about all that, and then I'll stop. Um, there was a metaphor that I read about in a book. So you see this pyramid. They said, imagine
Yes.
that AI is like a rising tide, like water coming up. So imagine that this is a desert island, and the water is coming. It's going like this. The question is, what are the jobs at the top? What are the jobs that AI takes over last? Well, at the bottom of that chart are things like in a supermarket. I live in New Zealand. So in a supermarket, people don't go to the checkout thing anymore. They just check themselves out, right? So that's the type of job that robots have sort of taken over. Um, or illustrators. Illustrators, it's very hard for illustrators right now because you just can just find stock photography and stock art so easily. So those jobs are at the bottom and they're already being swallowed up. And we've seen it. But then you go, okay, but what's at the top? What's at the very tippy top of the thing? What's the thing that AI can take over the slowest? And it's being good at speaking, being good at talking, at teaching, being good at inspiring, being good at entrepreneurial skills, thinking about strategy, all of that. So I'm aware that I'm talking to a bunch of UX people, and I'm essentially telling everybody, don't do UX. But again, I just have to be honest, like that's what's happening is like UX is no longer the future. It's dying out. And so the key is how do you make that next jump where you're still doing design, but it's not something that someone can just type into Chat GPT and replace you with.
So when you say that, what I'm hearing is that how can I make myself better than AI, essentially?
Yep.
It's definitely something to think on. Yes. Wow. I've been so focused on trying to learn Figma and tools and reading books and learning people and understanding biases and the human mind and how that works and also networking and but what you just said really puts an awareness in my mind as well to again look at the landscape of what's happening and not just live in my small world uh, where I'm learning UX. because I must expand rather than just learn this small thing. So thank you so much for that. Um, really, really helpful.
Yeah, and I'm sorry that the news is so sad, but I'm excited for you because, yeah, there are a lot of people in your boat who they're learning all the same things you're learning. They're all going to be very disappointed if that's all they do. But you have the ability, especially because you're talking to a lot of people in the field. A lot of people say similar things that I'm saying.
Mm.
Um,
Yes.
you and anyone that you talk to and anyone that watches this, you have the ability to leap forward, and you'll be okay. So. Yeah, well, I'll say one last thing about that. Apple likes to quote Wayne Gretzky, the guy that played hockey. And he has this great quote that sounds silly, but that's actually very wise. People asked how he was so good at hockey, and he says, "You don't go to where the puck is, you go to where the puck will be." So and this applies to rugby, it applies to soccer, to football, like it applies to a lot of sport, basketball for sure. In basketball, they're not running to like where the ball currently is. You're like thinking like, okay, you know, LeBron James has the ball, but because of the way that we're all situated, he's probably going to pass over here. So I should probably go, that's just strategy, right? And I think that's what designers need to think about, all the basic learning that you have to start with.
Awesome. Now I'm excited because I have a lot of learning to do. I'm still starting at the very start, still at the very beginning of my journey. So there is a lot to learn, and yeah, I'm glad that I'm made aware of all of these things now versus being 5 months or 1 year into my journey and not having learned or heard any of those things. So yes, I'm really, really grateful for all of this, the conversation that we're having right now. And if anybody is listening to this, I would say to you, just take the advice. Don't be that person that listens, doesn't do. I would recommend that you go ahead and put in the work because, like you said, the landscape is changing. I don't know if you've noticed or if you've been sitting in your corner, but I've definitely seen it. A lot of people are losing jobs, and a lot of things are happening simultaneously. So if you're in my position, I would also encourage you to take the leap and do something else, not just UX. Okay. With that said, I'm not too sure where else to go from here. I think that it's a lot to think about and a lot to ponder on. So thank you, thank you, John. I really, really appreciate this conversation that we just had. Um, and so
Absolutely.
before we stop, where else could people reach out to you? Is there something else you would want to say, or yeah?
I will say, if anyone watches all the way to the end of this video, I will say two people respond, obviously. But I find that more people select my name on threads is like I enjoy that kind of thing. I enjoy. And my email address is JB for Jon Bell, JB at lot23.com, because my website is lot23.com. You might be surprised if you write me or people like me. It makes us feel good as old people. when when people write and they say like, "Hey, I have a question," we don't always have the time and we don't always get around to it. But like I said, like in my career, I was surprised how many people actually were nice to me. So I that's what I would say is like, feel free to reach out to me. And I might surprise you with a big wall of text about whatever questions you have. But also do that with other people. Like, I would even make it like a goal, like team talkative line or whatever. Try reaching out to 5 of them, because in my experience, at least 2 or 3 of them will absolutely respond, and probably with more detail and more interest than you might imagine. I would highly recommend that with me and with anyone.
That's true. I can say so from my own experience. So um, yeah. Okay, thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this conversation and that you learned something. If you did learn something, let me know in the chat what you learned and how it was beneficial to you. Until the next time, bye. Enjoy.